Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Chitheads. I'm your host, Jacob Kyle. Today I had a conversation with Shree Nahata. Shree was actually a fellow student of mine while I was studying at the University of Oxford. While I was doing my MPhil in classical Indian religion, Shree was a DPhil student doing his doctoral research on the Buddhist philosopher Dharmakirti. Shree focused his DPhil research on the Buddhist philosophy of Dharmakirti as well as Jain philosophy. I thought it would be nice to talk to Shree because I had some wonderful conversations with him while we were at Oxford together, and I've always considered him a very dynamic and articulate, clear thinker who has a lot of passion for what he's studying, and so I knew that talking to him about Jain philosophy in particular would be really worthwhile. Because we haven't explored Jainism so much on the podcast before, I thought it would be interesting to talk to Shree about some of the fundamental concepts to give us a broader, more comprehensive kind of introductory picture of the Jain philosophy and why some of the philosophical principles and perspectives of Jainism are really quite relevant to our times. One of the most insightful and profound perspectives that the Jains hold is this principle of anekantavada, which is a principle of perspectivism that advocates for a pluralistic relationship with truth. By contrast with a lot of philosophies and spiritual or religious worldviews, Jainism doesn't say that there's just one truth and this tradition, the Jain tradition, for example, has it all right, but rather suggests that all religious traditions, all philosophies hold a partial view of truth. Every tradition is, in a sense, partially true. So instead of a kind of either-or relationship to reality, it's either impermanence or it's permanent. It's either non-duality or it's duality. The Jain tradition suggests that it's both and. All of these diverse traditions, with their unique philosophical, ontological, and epistemological commitments, each one of them is true. And so this tradition is pluralistic in being able to hold a conception of truth that actually embraces contradictions rather than tries to resolve them. And in a world where there's an increasingly fundamentalist attachment to this doctrine or that dogma, Jainism presents a pluralistic and open-minded perspective. For those of us who are committed to the study of yoga philosophy, I think that this principle of anekantavada is fundamental. On the basis of this principle, we can embrace a wide range of different philosophical and yogic traditions without claiming that one tradition is more valid or more correct than another. With this value, with this principle as our starting point, we can begin to appreciate the relative value of various traditions, even when they seem to contradict each other. So with that, let's get into this conversation with Shree Nahata. As usual, please leave us a positive review on iTunes. It really does help us get this podcast in front of more listeners. And if you haven't done so yet, please follow us on YouTube. Follow the Embodied Philosophy channel on YouTube and also the Chitheads channel. We will be posting on both for a while, but we're really trying to increase our following on the Embodied Philosophy YouTube because we're starting to offer a lot more resources, a lot more video content, video teachings on our YouTube channel. If you love the podcast and you want to support us, please consider leaving us a small donation at buymeacoffee.com/chitheads. That's buymeacoffee.com/chitheads. You can leave a donation for as little as $5. Thank you all so much for being devoted listeners of the Chitheads podcast. Now, let's get into today's interview. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Chitheads podcast. I'm Jacob Kyle, and today I'm here with friend and colleague, I'd like to say, Shree Nahata. Shree, am I pronouncing your last name correctly?
Yeah, that's perfect. Nahata, yeah.
I feel like it's a short right? So Nahata.
Exactly.
Shree was a doctoral student while I was in the MPhil program at the University of Oxford, a program that I did for 2 years that ended last August. And Shree was always a very full of life figure who had a lot of thoughts about the readings that we would do in the, what was it called? The Graduate Indology Seminar.
Right.
You were always one of the most vocal, Shree, and you were never afraid of a debate, which was always kind of nice and fresh in an environment where, there wasn't so much debate in some of those seminars. But Shree was also a tutor for me in Sanskrit. He tutored my cohort through our kind of elementary Sanskrit program while I was at Oxford. And Shree is a wonderful and very accomplished Sanskritist, certainly more accomplished than me, and he has just recently completed his DPhil program and did his research on Jain philosophy and Buddhist philosophy. Am I correct?
That's perfect. Yeah, that's right.
What was the kind of summary of your project, just to give people a little taste?
So my project was basically working on a Buddhist philosopher and a Jain philosopher and the debate between them. So we know that Buddhist philosophy is a very long tradition spanning more than a millennia and a half. And the same is true of Jain philosophy. And I feel like a lot of people have worked on Buddhist and Jain philosophy in general, but I wanted to focus in. So I focused in on a Buddhist philosopher called Dharma. So he's a very famous Buddhist philosopher who was associated, at least in biographies, with Nalanda, the famed university of ancient India in modern-day Bengal, Bihar, the eastern region of India. So he lived in approximately the early 7th century. And the Jain philosopher I worked on was someone called Akalanka, who lived a century later in South India, in Karnataka. So although they were separated by thousands of miles, even in that day and age, Akalanka had read all of Dharmakirti's works. It's very evident. So it's an interesting thing to think about how knowledge traveled so quickly in the ancient world. And I focused in on these two philosophers, more specifically working on their theories of perception. So perception is one of the most basic sources of knowledge in all of Indian philosophy, in all Indian philosophical schools, whether Hindu, Buddhist, or Jain. However, the way perception is understood is very different in different philosophical schools. So just to give a taste, if you are an anti-realist and you think that the world is in some sense illusory, then you're going to distrust the evidence of our senses, i.e. our perceptual knowledge. Whereas if you're a realist, you will think that perception and our sensory knowledge of the world is the most reliable thing we can possibly have. And so that was kind of the flavor, the Buddhists being the anti-realists and the Jains being the realists. And I examined the debate between these two, Buddhist and Jain philosophers. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I imagine our conversation will kind of give a little bit of context to help situate that project, because what I'd like to do today, and what I've more or less promised those who have shown up here live. Oh, and by the way, hello to you out there who are tuning in live. This is a rare opportunity that we have to share the Chitheads podcast in a live format. I just kind of thought to do it a half hour ago and was like, well, why not? We'll stream it onto YouTube and I'll send out an email and give everyone an opportunity to tune in. So since we have this rare opportunity, after we move through our questions together, I'll open it up to you. So if you have any questions and you want to ask Shree something, then do add that question. I can see it in the kind of shared YouTube chat, and I'll turn to that if you have any kind of clarifying questions or questions as it relates to the Jain philosophy. Obviously, Shree is a scholar, and his work is very focused on philosophical discussions and arguments. But today I'm going to try to kind of zoom out and give a little bit, with the help of Shree, a little bit of an introductory overview of kind of the fundamental principles of Jain philosophy, especially since we haven't really done much on the Chitheads podcast before. I haven't actually interviewed anybody about Jainism, so this should be a fun opportunity. So Shree, before we get into that, I would love to hear, I enjoyed reading your article, the essay that you wrote it was kind of more popular sort of personal essay, and you were sharing kind of what brought you to the study of Indian philosophy, and you were born a Jain. You were born into a Jain family, right. But you kind of came full circle, came back to really feeling the merits and the profundity of Jain philosophy. But I'd love to hear a little bit about what your sort of philosophical journey was and what led you to really want to focus on this work.
Yeah, thank you, Jacob. That's a really good question. I mean, like most people who end up taking philosophy courses in academia, most of my initial training in philosophy was in Western philosophy. So Indian philosophy is generally not very well represented in philosophy departments. But my undergraduate degree was at the University of Hong Kong. And because it was Hong Kong, which is a very peculiar mixture of East Asian and Western culture, they had courses in Buddhist philosophy. So I ended up going to one of those courses, and we ended up reading Nagarjuna in translation. And that was a revelatory experience for me. It was the first encounter with Indian philosophy as something which is really sophisticated, full of logical arguments, rather than the popular perception that it's just a matter of religious belief, and full of interesting and novel approaches to philosophical questions. So that's really what got me interested in studying Indian philosophy, learning Sanskrit, and then studying Indian philosophical texts. That accidental or chance decision, I'd say, to take that Buddhist philosophy course. And coming to Jain philosophy, so I got into Indian philosophy through Buddhist philosophy, but then I had always wondered that I grew up in a Jain family, and we had all of these rituals and we had these religious practices, but we never really discussed too many of the ideas. And so when I started learning Sanskrit and reading Indian philosophical texts, I thought maybe I should re-examine my own upbringing and my own tradition, because I think that there are benefits to being born in a tradition. You're in that embodied space where you can practice, but also sometimes we become a bit lazy about things if you're born in a tradition.
So you were just speaking of the fact that when we are embedded in a sort of our own home tradition, we don't often question it.
Yeah, so that's exactly it's when we are born in a tradition, when we when we are raised in a tradition, I think we often take things for granted. We are embedded in a set of practices, but we often don't ask why are we doing these practices. And often the practices encode a deeper set of philosophical and religious ideas which are rarely discussed. It becomes a kind of boring orthopraxy where you just do a certain set of rituals and that's that. And so I think for me, the really interesting thing was, okay, I'm born in a Jain family. We have these wonderful values of non-violence, ahimsa, and we have these beautiful religious practices. But why are we why do we worship the Tirthankara, for example, the enlightened beings in Jainism? What is it that they actually discovered about the nature of reality that makes them enlightened in the first place? So I got interested in these questions. And once one gets interested in these questions, I think that's when one starts entering the realm of philosophy.
So let's get right into it then. So, you mentioned, and this is kind of where I was going to start, many people, when they hear of Jainism, or if they know anything about Jainism, it's essentially nonviolence. Like, this is kind of I think if you could boil it down to one thing that people tend to know about Jainism, it's that there's a kind of almost quite radical nonviolence by comparison to the nonviolence that you find in other traditions. So, and I would love to talk about kind of the role of that sort of deity type of worship in Jainism, since from what I understand, Jainism is a atheistic tradition. Is that correct?
I mean, that's a very loaded question. It just depends on how you define the concept of God. So I think for many of us who grew up in the Anglosphere reading things in English, God is usually defined as an omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent entity who created the universe. And if we accept that definition, then Jainism is atheistic, because Jainism, like Buddhism and several other Indian traditions, does not believe that the universe was created by any being as such. Samsara, the Indian term for the universe we live in, is something which is beginningless and endless. So there is no definitive origin point, and there is no being controlling all of samsara. So samsara is governed by karma, which is an impersonal law impersonal moral law, whereby you reap the benefits or the disastrous consequences of your actions, basically. So there's no God if we start with a Judeo-Christian, basically an Abrahamic conception of God. But if we start with the concept of God if we challenge that concept of God and think of it in a broader way, if we think that, okay, God is someone, if we think of God as some sort of ideal we are aspiring to, rather than a being controlling everything. If we think of God as some being or maybe an impersonal entity representing the perfection of knowledge, wisdom, virtue, compassion, and all of these good qualities, then Jainism is very much a theistic religion in the sense that the founders of Jainism are the Tirthankaras, literally ford makers. So the image is one of we are stuck on one side of this river that is samsara, and the ford is the place where we can cross over to safety to the other side. So they are the beings who help us cross this river or ocean of samsara, and they are omniscient. So they are understood explicitly as omniscient beings who have understood the entirety of reality, but they don't control our fate. Our fate is solely in our own hands. And the Tirthankara is not a god in the sense of a being who controls everything, but he very much is a god, and she as well in one of the Jain traditions, who represents the perfection of wisdom and the perfection of compassion. So I think we need to challenge the dominant conceptions of God, because I feel like if we are stuck in the Abrahamic conception of God, then we'll just define Jainism negatively, whereas we need to think about what Jainism offers positively. What's the ideal?
Yes, you're speaking my language for sure. Reconceiving and conceptualizing God feels like that's my life's project. So I liked what you said in your personal essay about karma being something that you found quite liberating as a concept. And, obviously there's so many kind of folk understandings of karma but one thing that I have just generally observed is that many people bristle at karma because they feel it's determinative, that as if my whole life is, determined by these things that happened in previous lives. And therefore there's this sense that it's somehow constraining in that way. So can you talk a little bit about karma and how you see it as actually, different from like an oppressive, like overly determinative concept, but actually something that can be quite liberating?
Right. Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think the way karma is understood in Jainism, but also in other traditions such as Buddhism and in some Hindu traditions as well, is that it is an impersonal law governing the universe, but it's an explicitly moral law whereby every action we perform has consequences. So good actions, to simplify, good actions lead to good consequences and bad actions lead to bad consequences. However, the question arises, is it a kind of determinism? And the answer is explicitly no. Because if it was a kind of determinism, there could be no Mahavira, the enlightened, one of the enlightened beings in Jainism, or there could be no Buddha. Because the very fact that you can become this enlightened being means that you can overcome the trappings of karma and transcend it. And that precisely is the goal in Jainism as well as in many Indian traditions. So I think it's very important to get that misconception out of our head, because the goal is precisely to transcend karma. And what karma does essentially is it does two things. So we observe that in our ordinary lives, we encounter something of a mixture of freedom and constraint. So obviously not everything is under our control, right? We are born with a set of constraints. So the fact that I was born in India in a Jain family and had a particular upbringing was not something I chose. It was just something those were the cards I was allotted, so to speak. However, we also realize that not everything in our life is constrained. I mean, I can choose, for example, to learn Sanskrit or not to learn Sanskrit. I can choose to believe in Jainism or not. And so I have many choices that I can make in life as well. So I think karma is beautiful because it accounts for both of these aspects of life. So the constraints that we have in our life, the constraints we experience through our birth, through our environment, and so on, is explained in Indian karmic theory as a result of the actions we performed in previous lifetimes. And that is an explanation for why certain constraints, we are always situated in an environment which constrains us in some ways. So that's the backward looking dimension of karma. That's the constraining dimension of karma. But karma is also forward looking. So karma is also about me acting in the present to create a new future for myself. Whether we understand that future as the future in this life or future lives, that's not the important point. The point is that what I do now, the choices I make now, will determine my future. And so this is extremely liberating for me, precisely because as someone who went to like a Christian convent school, the idea that we were always raised with is that there is a God who controls our destiny. Ultimately, we are completely powerless, and it's ultimately the will of God which decides whether I am saved or not, or whether I'm X or Y, or what I get in life or don't get in life. And for me, that always seemed, I don't know, maybe it's my teenage rebel self, that I didn't like the idea that my fate depended on someone above me with whom I had no idea of, whom I had no clue who he or she was. So I didn't like that idea at all. And when I encountered the idea of karma in Buddhism and Jainism, it was liberating, because it meant that my fate, my destiny, my future ultimately depends on me. And this is extremely liberating. Although, of course, if you think in existentialist terms, it can also have that burden of responsibility. So it can be a burden as well. Like, it all depends on you. And for some people, that might be frightening. But for me, that's liberating, because it's all in my hands, ultimately, fundamentally. It's not in the hands of some capricious deity out there whom I have to pacify to have a good life. That's not what it's about. And so this is extremely liberating, because it means that we control our lives, we control who we are, and we control our choices. And I think there's nothing more liberating if we view karma in that way, whether in Jainism or Buddhism or in various Indian religions. Karma is an extremely liberating concept for that reason.
That was excellent, Shreya. We're going to have to extract that little bit on karma out just for its own sort of educational resource, because that was really great. Very comprehensive and insightful. So I want to now talk a little bit. I actually want to come back to the question of ethics, which obviously is connected to karma. But I want to talk a little bit about the metaphysics, the metaphysical understanding of Jainism, because as I've, I am, only beginning to kind of scratch the surface of Jainism personally. But one of the things that, another thing besides the nonviolence that many people know about is kind of this parable of the blind men and the elephant, and this sort of doctrine or principle of perspectivism or perspectivalism. And it's really a kind of radical and seemingly quite progressive, if that's a correct word to put on it, type of assertion and principle. So would you talk about the doctrine of Anekantavada from starting kind of from that parable of the blind man and the elephant?
Right. So yeah, that's, I think, the best place to start with Jain philosophy is this idea of Anekantavada. So the parable of the blind man and the elephant is, the story goes that there was an elephant and a king invited a lot of blind men to come and examine the elephant. Obviously, being blind, they couldn't see the elephant, so they used their other sensory modalities, such as touch and so on, to understand what the elephant is. So one of them touched the leg of the elephant, and it was as sturdy as the trunk of a tree. And he exclaimed, "Oh, this is the trunk of a tree." Another blind man touched the tail of the elephant, and it felt like a rope. So he exclaimed that, "Oh no, this is not the trunk of a tree. This is like a rope, basically." And so on and so on. So what this story represents is that our knowledge is always partial and conditioned by our perspective. So this is why this story is very good, but there's a limitation to this story as well. And I don't think it's the best way of understanding Jain philosophy, because the Jain understanding of reality fundamentally is that our knowledge is conditioned by perspectives, and every perspective has a partial truth to it. The way we get to the complete truth is by combining all of these perspectives across knowers and across time and space. This is something that can't be done in the case of the blind man and the elephant. I can't imagine all the blind men coming together, putting their data together, and somehow arriving at elephant. So I don't think it's the best example, but it's a good start, I feel. Okay, so Anekantavada is a very interesting and I think one of the most amazing philosophical ideas I've ever come across. So let's think of it this way. All philosophical traditions across different cultures, whether it be India, China, Greece, Rome, or other cultures, have grappled with fundamental philosophical questions, right? So, is reality permanent? Is reality impermanent? So, the Upanishads, for example, in the Indian case, say that what is ultimately real is Brahman, this impersonal force underlying the whole universe, and that is permanent. On the other hand, if we read the Buddhist suttas, where the Buddha is teaching his disciples, the Buddha explicitly says that one of the fundamental characteristics of reality is that everything is impermanent, anicca, right? So, and this is paralleled in other philosophical traditions. So we have Parmenides and Heraclitus in the Greek tradition, which represents a kind of similar contrasting pair. So what the Jains did is that they noticed that these philosophical debates were already ongoing in India at that time. This is the 5th or the 6th century before Christ, right? And what they did is that instead of choosing one side and saying that this side is right, oh, reality ultimately is permanent, I just have a better argument why, or reality is impermanent, I have a new argument why. What they said is actually both of these perspectives are kind of partially true. And what they said is that what we need to do is to put these two perspectives together to arrive at the complete truth. So that is the fundamental idea of Anekantavada. So talking about permanence and impermanence, for example, the Jains said, obviously there is a kind of permanence and constancy to our lives. It's not like we wake up every morning and everything is suddenly changed, like, right? No, I mean, our mental lives do display some sort of continuity. Our physical bodies also display some sort of continuity. So the idea that everything is changed and everything is impermanent is a bit absurd given our own experience. On the other hand, the idea that everything is permanent and constant is also absurd because we do notice that we change in such infinitely tiny and small ways, perhaps every moment, every day, but over time these changes obviously become visible. So the Jains are very famous for starting with a very common sense realist perspective. They talk about what our experience in our ordinary lives is. So in our ordinary lives, we experience that there is change, small, sometimes big, sometimes, but there's also permanence or constancy. And so they say that reality is both permanent in some respects and impermanent in some respects. And the same can be said on any perennial philosophical question. So are universals real or particulars? Well, both. There are similarities we encounter in reality, so there have to be universals. But everything also has its own flavor and nature, so there are particulars as well. And so that is the Jaina principle of Anekantavada. What the Jainas really understood is that these debates have a fundamental erroneous presupposition that it has to be either or. It's either impermanent or permanent. It's either universal or particular. It's either substance or property. They instead advocated the approach of both and. So it's both universal and particular, both substance and property, both permanent and impermanent. And so that is the Jaina idea of Anekantavada. And the beauty of this idea for me, if we think about it, is that reality in this Jain view becomes an infinitely complex thing with so many new aspects to discover every day. Reality is not a closed thing because reality for the Jainas instantiates every possible contradictory pair we can imagine. So reality is something which is boundless, it's endless, and anything we look for, we can find it in reality. So it's not a very constrained or limited vision of reality, which says that reality is X and that's all there is to it. It says that no, reality is X and not X, and the number of X's, by the way, is infinite in Jainism. So the number of characteristics that any entity has is infinite. So this is a beautiful thing because it's like for example, if you just eat a mango, it has its own flavor, its own taste. But every time you eat a new mango, there's something new about every mango. And there's some new thing you discover. You could do it like endlessly, but it's like the mango is never exhausted. Your experience of eating the mango, you always learn something new from it. And that is precisely the Jaina view of reality, that reality is this endlessly expansive thing which instantiates all opposites, we can imagine. And there's always more and more aspects out there for us to discover. And this, for me, as you said, progressive, but also for me, it's a liberating idea. It frees us from this kind of constrained thinking. Too often, I feel philosophical systems constrain us, but the Jainas expand our vision, I feel.
Wow. Yeah, I think that this idea is just one of the most incredibly rich ones, like you say, that I've ever encountered. And it feels like really anybody, when they begin studying philosophy, it's like this should be the starting point. It just has a natural open-mindedness to it that you just don't find in other places. I mean, even when you see a little bit of a hint toward a kind of open-minded like this, I'm thinking of Abhinavagupta when he talks about how, the Buddhists and the Jains, these all are differing views that based on one's perspective of consciousness is a valid and true perception. But then, of course, it's like, but still the Shaivas are the highest. And the non-dual perspective is ultimately, the best. So even there, they ultimately kind of default to this hierarchy. But I'm curious about, because one thing that seems to be similar to this view, or at least it kind of reminds me of, is sort of the postmodernist approach, or rather idea of kind of cultural contingency, right? That there are all these kind of culturally contingent language games, and and now you're seeing more and more people arguing that these are incommensurable, and we can never kind of get into we can't kind of across that epistemological threshold and inhabit someone else's experience. And so I'm wondering how you see this kind of principle of perspectivalism or perspectivism as different from a kind of form of cultural relativism.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and one I must admit I haven't thought enough about. But I think firstly, it's very important to acknowledge that this was not a question that was necessarily dealt with in the classical sources, because the classical sources are often in Sanskrit and Prakrit, and it's within a cultural framework. It's not done interculturally. But okay, let's start with the Jaina philosophical worldview and see what the Jaina philosophical worldview might have to say about these things. So, I mean, one of the things that's very important is that the Jainas are not relativists who believe that there is no truth out there. So if we define relativism as the proposition that there is no objective truth, then the Jainas don't believe in that. The Jainas instead are subscribing to believe in something which sounds similar but is very different. What the Jainas believe is that each of us apprehends a part of the truth, not the complete truth. Because we as embodied knowers, our perspectives are contingent and therefore limited. And so what we know is not false, but it's a part of the truth. And the second step to this is that if we can put all of these different perspectives together, the perspectives of different competent knowers together, we can arrive at a more complete picture of the entire thing, reality as it is. So what the Jainas start with is that every perspective or every competent knower captures the truth partially, but putting this together and synthesizing them together is what helps us to get at the complete truth, if you will. So thinking about postmodernism and cultural relativism, so if we define relativism as the view that there is no objective truth, then I think there's a gap. But if we define relativism as the idea that what we know is contingent on our perspectives, and if we expand the idea of perspectives with our modern sensibilities, that our perspectives are not just conditioned by our environment and birth and so on, but also by our language, the cultural knowledge systems we are embedded in, and so on, then I think, yes, the Jainas would very much be on board with the idea. I think that our knowledge is conditioned by these parameters, by our language, our embedded knowledge systems. That doesn't mean that what we know is wrong. It just means that what we know is true relative to those parameters, relative to those our language, our embedded knowledge systems. And the thing that the Jainas really add to the conversation is that if we can put all of this together, we can arrive at a more complete picture of the truth. So if I'm raised in England, let's say, and I've grown up in this Abrahamic or at least even an English empiricist worldview, what I know is not wrong. It's contingent on the framework I start with. But the way to arrive at the more complete truth, and the Jainas definitely believe that there is a complete truth, is to talk to people from other frameworks. So to talk to someone who's raised in India and starts with a completely different set of assumptions, or someone who grew up in China and has a completely different language, a completely different cultural framework. So putting these together from the Jaina perspective is what will lead us to the complete truth. So I think it's what it offers is a constructive project. So the postmodern project often feels like we're all in our separate worlds and that's that, we can't really move past that. At least in some formulations, it feels like that. But the Jainas are very much offering a constructive alternative. Yes, we are in our own worlds to some extent, but that doesn't mean that that's a good thing. The goal is precisely to get out of this, our own limited worlds, and engage with people inhabiting other worlds, and then try to piece everything together to come up with a fuller picture. So, and I think this is exactly what we try to do, right? This is exactly what you're trying to do on this podcast as well, is to bring out these different perspectives from the Indian traditions, but also the Western traditions and other cultures. And if we can bring them together and synthesize them, then we can arrive at a more complete picture. This is exactly the Jaina view.
This sort of reminds me, I was talking to someone the other day about the perennial philosophy and the way in which it sort of fell from grace, right, at a certain historical moment, because, right, the perennial philosophy being this idea that sort of all religious traditions, all spiritual paths, all contemplative worldviews ultimately are saying the same thing. And then the critique ended up being that when someone is, positing this, ultimately that they end up, that sort of singular perennial philosophy that everything is an expression of ends up looking like one particular tradition. But this, it seems to suggest kind of a different way of imagining the perennial philosophy where it's not that you're saying, okay, this kind of boiled down, distillation of a particular tradition is, the simplified, version of all of them. And therefore we can just, shun all the kind of culturally contingent components of all these various religious traditions, but rather all of these religious traditions or philosophical perspectives can hold their breadth and expansiveness. And by adding to it and bringing them in conversation, there's something that we sort of, a truth that kind of emerges. It's like an emergent property of the sort of increasing integration and communication of many worldviews. Is that a way of thinking about it?
Yeah, that's a very interesting way of thinking about it. I mean, I think the big difference, I don't think it's perennial philosophy, the vision that the Jains have. And I think the reason is that the perennialists often say that all religious and philosophical traditions are ultimately teaching the same thing. If you go deep down into it, it's like the same truth is everywhere. But the Jains are precisely not saying that. The Jains are saying that each and every religious and philosophical tradition has its own unique perspective. So it's not that there's the same thing which we can discover if we just read deeply enough and interpret things the right way. It's precisely that all of these traditions are different. So that's the Jain starting point. And the second thing is that the perennialists, because they start with this idea that all traditions are ultimately teaching the same thing, the vision they come up with is a very monolithic and uniform vision of reality, which all of these traditions instantiate. But the Jain vision of reality is precisely not monolithic. It's a vision of reality as infinitely complex and diverse. And so now we can see why all traditions can be teaching different things, but they can all be true because reality itself is a lot of different things. It's not this monolithic, uniform, singular thing, whatever that thing might be. So reality itself has many different aspects. So one of the terms is like ananta dharma. So there are endless dharmas, dharma here being characteristic. So every entity has infinitely many characteristics. So we have no problem with the idea that there are multiple philosophical and religious traditions because each of them is picking out a set of characteristics of that reality. And we need not flatten those characteristics out like the perennialists do to say that they're all ultimately just expressions of some fundamental thing below it. No, all of these characteristics are equally real. And so the Jain vision is, I think, more interesting for me than the perennialist vision, because it allows us to engage with different traditions without saying, that what the tradition is saying is ultimately the same as what my tradition is saying. Because then it can turn into some sort of, I'm reading another tradition through my own lens, and I'm like reinterpreting that tradition in terms that suit my own prior beliefs, which I think can be a bit unfair. So the Jain approach allows each tradition to be unique and be interpreted on its own terms, which I think is a much healthier vision.
Yes, definitely. Okay, so I'm thinking of, and I realize, this is a question that, like you said, it's important to distinguish between like what would have been something that the Jains are actually interacting with philosophically and ideologically in some sense in this cultural context of the text that you study, and also kind of like trying to do some thinking with some Jain ideas in this contemporary moment. And I'm curious what you think the status of the objective world would then be, and like, let's say those forms of inquiry, like scientific inquiry, that are attempting to sort of boil down, the material world to some sort of core components. Would the Jains also say, well, yes, this is also just a certain view of the truth, and that truth is ultimately, or like, I guess I'm wondering how they interact with the kind of idea of this, we could say, small t truth of a particular perspective and tradition, and then this capital T truth, that all of those small t truths are one way of expressing some portion of.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a very good question. And I mean, the aspect that I feel interesting is precisely if we frame it very starkly, if like Buddhism ultimately says that each perspective, each philosophical religious tradition captures the truth partially and is valid in its own right, then what about science? Is it just another thing alongside all of these philosophical and religious traditions? Because that's not how science is understood by most scientists and people who study science, right? It's understood as something which is more fundamental and grounds everything. So I think that's a very interesting question. And again, this is, we have to think with Jain ideas. Obviously, modern science and the kind of paradigm we have is a very recent invention. It's important to keep in mind. I mean, the scientific revolution is only 3 or 4 centuries old, which is nothing in the scale of human history. But thinking through Jain ideas, I think the really important thing for the Jains is that they're common sense realists. So what does that mean? They start with our ordinary experience of the world. They in fact say, let's think pre-philosophically. Like philosophy can sometimes end up making us believe absurd things, right? I mean, lots of crazy theories about, angels on a pin or whatever. I mean, a lot of theoretical speculation can go haywire if it's divorced from our ordinary experience of the world. So the Jains always start with common sense realism. Our ordinary experience of the world is where we have to start. So let's think of it this way. Okay, so let's say that a scientific theory says that this table ultimately is composed of atoms, or if we go further, it's composed of strings or something. If we go to string theory, or if we think in terms of quantum physics, then the fundamental particles would be slightly different. Now, the scientists would say that this is what's ultimately real, these fundamental particles, and the table is either secondary or illusory. That would be a fair statement of, if you subscribe to a scientific worldview where science is actually unlocking that fundamental level. So the Jains would disagree with this. And the reason they would disagree with this is because they would kind of start with a kind of transcendental argument. Like, all of our scientific experimenting and theorizing already presupposes common sense reality, where we actually interact with tables and chairs. I mean, even if you're doing experiments in the lab, you are actually engaging at that very level of tables, chairs, medium-sized objects, and so on. Even when you publish a scientific paper, you're engaging in that very level of medium-sized objects or ordinary experience. Even when you argue about scientific theories, you are still operating at the level of ordinary experience. So the Jainas would say that it's self-contradictory for a scientist to claim. They can claim that there are fundamental particles. That's fine. The Jains would not themselves have an idea of a pre-modern form of atomism where there are fundamental atoms. What the Jains dispute is that this is somehow more real than our ordinary experience. They say that this is as real as our ordinary experience and other things. And the reason is we can only get to these fundamental particles by doing experiments at the level of ordinary experience. So how can you start with ordinary experience? If something presupposes ordinary experience, how can then that be used to refute and deny the validity of ordinary experience? See it as some sort of self-refuting paradoxical thing. And interestingly, this is one of the arguments that Akalanka, the Jain philosopher I worked on, uses against Dharmakirti, because the Buddhists in some ways are a precursor of this modern scientific reductionism, at least a certain vein of Abhidharma Buddhism, which tries to reduce reality into fundamental atomic constituents and says that this is what's real and everything else we experience is purely conventional. It's merely an epiphenomenon at best. It's not ultimately real. So the Jains reject that. And I think that's how they would respond to modern science as well. It's fine to say that there are these fundamental particles. It's fine to say that they exist. Scientific theories establish them. But if a scientist uses that to claim that our ordinary experience is therefore completely secondary or illusory, that is philosophically flawed, because all of their theories postulating these fundamental particles themselves presuppose ordinary experience. You can never get out of this ordinary experience. So I think it's a very sophisticated response, which doesn't say that science is whatever. It respects the validity of science, but it also prevents us from falling into a kind of scientism, which says that science is the only ultimately real theory of our everything, And I think that excess of science, which we can label scientism, is what the Jain philosophical worldview rejects.
That is so interesting, Shree. I want you to write an article about the Jain response to scientism. That is so interesting. I mean, it makes me think of something that I kind of encountered a long time ago, when I can't remember who it was, but some sort of neuroscientist who said that, once we, have a more thorough vocabulary for these neurons that are firing, we will actually begin to stop referring to our emotions and like, I feel sad, but rather, neuron 573 is firing with 689. Like, it's just so ridiculous. I mean, I know I'm probably bastardizing what this person said, but that idea, right? And that's such an interesting way of tackling the issue, right? It's like because ultimately that vocabulary and that way of speaking about it is grounded on everyday experience. It sort of reminds me of a little bit of the argument of, right, the Pratyabhishna, where it's like, Buddhists, you say that, there is no self and there's only change, but in the very articulation of that, in the moment when you even speak, you are already presupposing consciousness. You're already presupposing this faculty that then the Shaivas say is ultimately the origin. So that's so fascinating. So what else kind of helps us flesh out this picture of Jainism? Like, are there any other kind of key principles or concepts that we are missing to kind of really help us understand what the Jains are really focused on and interested in philosophically?
Yeah, I think Anekantavada is the key, and that gives us a general overview of the most important Jain theory and contribution to philosophy, I think. But there are a few other things. One interesting thing is SÆDHANA. So Syad is a Sanskrit particle, which in this context means in some ways. So what the Jains say is that for any entity, X, let's say, you can say that X is F, where F is any property you're predicating to that entity, Syad in some ways. And you can also say X is not F, Syad in some ways. So what the Jains do is take this ontological theory that I've already sketched out, Anekantavada, and try to come up with a kind of convenient formalization of it in language. And the basic idea is SÆDHANA is a set of 7 predications. For our purposes, let's just focus on the first 2, since I think they capture the essence. You can say that an entity X is F, Syad in some ways, and an entity X is not F, Syad in some other ways. So this is, I think, the key word here is Syad. So everyone, the Jain says, is already asserting X is F. So let's say X is reality and F means permanent in this context. Let's take that as an example. So other philosophical schools are already saying reality is permanent or reality is impermanent. That would be not F. What the Jain says that you have to always conditionalize those assertions with Syad in some ways. So that supplies a set of parameters which helps us appreciate that our assertions are true given a certain set of parameters. There's no sense of truth independent of context and parameters. I think that is another fundamental Jain idea. Often we make claims, but we don't realize that our claims obviously have to be true in a context. Let me give you a simple example. Let's say I say there's a chair in this room. Now, it's true if it's talking about my room and the chair I'm sitting on, but there could be another room in which there's no chair. So even this proposition, there is a chair in the room, is true dependent on context. It depends on what the context of the assertion is, in which room we are making the statement. So the Jain says that this is something which is common sense. Everyone understands it. If I say there's a chair in the room, nobody has any idea that this is an abstract proposition about reality. Everyone contextualizes it. But somehow when we start doing philosophy, the Jains say, we forget that things are contextual. And we start talking in the abstract, that all of reality, independent of any context, is this way or that way. And Jains are like, let's go back to basics. Let's think pre-philosophically. Like, it's absurd to even assert a statement like there's a chair in the room independent of context. Like, whether that's true or false depends on context. And the Jains say that all of our statements are like that. So we should keep this in mind when we are philosophizing. We often make blanketing that when in what circumstance, and if we think that, then relative to the context, relative to the statement, relative disappear precisely because there is a chair in this room can be true in room 1 and false in room 2. There is no contradiction. This is something that's obvious, the Jains say, even to children who haven't been taught anything. But somehow when we start doing philosophy, we forget to contextualize, and then we encounter all of these massive contradictions, and we then feel puzzled, and we think that we have to choose one or the other. Whereas the solution is always to go back to basics and think like, what are we talking about? What's the context? What is the context of our assertion? In what circumstance could this statement be true, and in what circumstance could it be false? And that, I think, again, comes out of this very common sense realist approach, where we take our pre-philosophical practices seriously and realize that sometimes philosophy can mislead us. And this is a bit Wittgensteinian if you think of it in those terms. Like, we have a set of language games that we already have when we act in the ordinary world. But somehow when we start doing philosophy, we forget that these are language games and that meaning is tied to use and context and so on. And we abstract away from all of that and try to think in abstract whether reality is permanent. Like, maybe that's such a abstracted question that it doesn't even have a meaning. Like, what do you mean reality? Like, contextually, like, what are we talking about? What do you mean permanent? So once we contextualize things, contradictions disappear. I think this common sense strand of Jainism, which has a lot of resemblance to late Wittgenstein, is also a great tool because the Jains always try to dissolve philosophical problems instead of, building up the tension, as it were. They try to show that the problems disappear once we have a clear understanding of why we got into the problem in the first place.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I mean, I feel like that is just a sweet and appropriate and timely medicine for so much that's going on in the world. If we could, realize that the ability of just kind of dissolving problems when looking at under the proper light. I mean, perhaps we would be not in so much conflict around so many different things. So I want to talk about a couple more things before we close out our interview, which would be, well, first of all, just because I know there are a lot of yoga practitioners probably listening or watching. And by the way, for those of you who are watching, I'm recording this on what's called Riverside, and it uploads locally. So if there's been a little bit cutting and out, and maybe me and also Shree, the audio of this will be totally fine if you listen to it on the podcast. So if there's stuff that you've missed here and there, you listen to it again. So just so you're aware that because it uploads locally, that means when it creates the file afterwards, it will be complete without any gaps. So anyway, I wanted to talk about the perception that is unique to the yogis or the yogins. So, obviously, is to follow what you were saying about philosophy leading us astray. right? There is in the Indian tradition the system of pramanas, the means of knowledge, and depending on the tradition, different pramanas are kind of considered valid. If we think about even the Western philosophical tradition and its means of knowledge, certainly one that is not permissible, or even we don't even have a concept for, is this idea of perception that is specific to the yogic experience. So I would love for you to talk a little bit about that, Shree, and unpack it a little, how you see it kind of variable depending on maybe different philosophical traditions, maybe name a couple if you like, and then how we can think about this means of knowledge, which seems like extra discursive, non-discursive, outside language in some sense. How does that become a philosophical mode of a means of knowledge?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's one of the most interesting things when we think about Indian philosophy in general is this idea of yogic perception. So as you said, I'll use a couple of examples, and the examples will be the Buddhist and Jain traditions, which is what I've worked on. So the Buddhist tradition obviously has an idea of yogi pratyaksha, but surprisingly, the Jain tradition also has this idea of yogi pratyaksha. So Akalanka talks about atindriya jnana. So there are synonyms that are used, but the idea is even in the Jain tradition, the Buddhist tradition, and in many Hindu traditions as well. So it seems to be a pan-religious philosophical idea that's common to most Indian religious philosophical traditions. However, as you rightly pointed out, the way it's understood is different in different traditions. So let me contrast, for example, the Jain and the Buddhist traditions. So the Jain tradition starts out with the idea, as we've already talked about, that reality is this infinitely complex thing with infinitely many aspects, and we are limited knowers. So we can only always get to so many finite aspects of an entity or of reality. And necessarily, because of our epistemic limitations, we can only cognize a small fraction of the full picture. So the idea then in the Jain tradition is that Mahavira, the Jain founders, whom we can call yogins in this case, are people who can cross over that barrier and somehow access all of reality. So that's the idea. They can access all of reality with all of its different dimensions, aspects, complexities, and they can see all of it. That's the Jain view. So how is that possible? I mean, the really interesting thing is that yogi perception is ultimately not a question of increasing the amount of information you have. So it's not like the way you get to it is just by, like, reality has infinitely many aspects. So if I just learn enough aspects day by day, I'll get to it. No, I mean, yogic perception in the Jain and in non-Jain traditions is a transformative thing brought about by your practice. So this is where it gets really interesting. The Mahavira, one of the enlightened beings in Jainism, did not achieve this complete knowledge of this infinitely complex reality because he read a lot of books and compiled the knowledge together. No, it was because he was practicing. And his practice included meditation, austerities, many other things. So what is this idea? I mean, the idea in the Jain tradition is that our self, so the Jains believe in an Atman, a self or a soul. They believe that the self has the capacity to know everything. Intrinsically, we have the capacity within us to know all of reality. It's just that this capacity is obscured by our vices, by karma, by other negative traits, and so on. So the path to achieving this yogic knowledge is to purify one's own self through one's practice. And the practice is a very diverse set of things, including meditation, austerities, there could be rituals as well, what have you. So by combining these practices, we purify ourselves, remove these defilements, as it were, so that we can let the intrinsically brilliant, powerful self that we have shine through and let it do what it can naturally do, which is it's full of energy, according to the Jains. It's full of bliss, sukha. It's also full of knowledge, jnana. So in this context, it has the capacity to know everything. So again, the problem is that this is a transformative question. And I think that is really, really important for us to appreciate. A lot of what we've been talking about has been philosophical theories, but fundamentally, these Indian philosophical traditions are interesting precisely because they address the fact that abstract knowledge is not enough. Mm-hmm. We are embodied beings who are living things existentially. And so abstract knowledge can only get you so far. It's your embodied existential practice that can bring about the final transformation. So that's the Jain tradition. So you can see that in the Jain tradition, what the enlightened beings know does not contradict what ordinary people know. It's just that ordinary people, such as you and I, have an incomplete knowledge of reality. We know things which are right. I mean, what we know is basically right, but it's incomplete. We don't have that full vision, whereas the enlightened beings have the full vision. Contrast this with the Buddhists, for example, Dharmakirti. So in the Buddhist tradition, this enlightened awareness is a kind of non-dual awareness which transcends all dualities, all philosophical concepts, all language. So this is something we are familiar with in Buddhism, but also various Hindu philosophical systems. So here, again, this is an existential transformative thing, because if it's something that transcends language and theorizing, then you can't get through it through writing more and more complex books. It's something that you have to achieve through a transformation of your experience, right? And non-dualism fundamentally is changing the way you perceive and experience the world. The problem, the Buddhists say, is that we're always so neurotic. We're always overthinking things. We're always coming up with theories. Like even before this podcast started, I probably already had like 10 assumptions about how it might or might not go, right? And like I already thought so many things about what you may or may not be thinking. So we're always stuck in these neurotic thought patterns where we're constantly conceptualizing, dividing reality and so on. And non-dual awareness is the state, as Nagarjuna says, when you get rid of all prapancha, when you're completely free from this hypostatization and you're just in that moment. And it's a state of non-duality, which is really important for the Buddhists because it means that I no longer distinguish between self and other. This is for the Buddhists the main problem, the idea that I am I and you are something separate from me. We need to get rid of this because A, it's not true. There is no such thing as an I and a you which are distinct, but also because this is the root cause of all suffering. It's precisely because I think I'm an I distinct from you that I'm willing to harm you for my own self-interest, right? Once we get rid of this idea, we are filled with a kind of universal compassion where we are no longer distinguishing between I and you, this and that, and so on. So again, non-dualism in Buddhism is fundamentally ethical, we can see. It's fundamentally a transformation of the way we experience things to get away from these neurotic thought patterns into a more blissful kind of awareness where we just take in things in the moment as they really are. So again, if this is the goal, you can't achieve this just by arguing further about philosophical theories. And therefore, the Buddha too became the Buddha precisely because he was meditating and cultivating a set of practices. However, the difference with so that's similar. But the difference with the Jain tradition is that the Buddha's awareness somehow completely contradicts our awareness. It's very different from our awareness. In the Jain tradition, as I said, our knowledge is basically fine, it's just incomplete, and enlightened being has a more complete picture. But in the Buddhist case, our knowledge is fundamentally dualistic. So it's fundamentally, in some sense, erroneous because we're stuck in these neurotic thought patterns which distinguish and divide and classify. And the enlightened awareness is something which transcends that and is in some sense very different from that. So there's this slight difference in the way yogic perception relates to ordinary knowledge. There are two things you could say. You could say that yogic perception complements and completes our ordinary knowledge, or yogic perception sublates and transcends our ordinary knowledge. So this is the difference we see in the Buddhist and Jain traditions. But also, as a kind of warning, I would say that, I mean, you can go with this and then say that all philosophy is basically useless. I can just sit down and figure everything out through my practice. And this is something that is warned against. So for example, Dharmakirti very, very clearly says in his definition of yogic perception that it's, for Dharmakirti, yogic perception is the experience you have of reality after you have perfected your meditation. That's really important for him. But meditation on real entities, you know, and he explicitly uses the word bhuta, which means real, and artha, which means object. So this is very important because I think there's a danger when we think of yogic perception purely as something unconstrained by any sort of philosophical inquiry. You can then meditate on literally anything, including something that's totally absurd and has no relation to reality. I can meditate, for example, on elephants on a fingertip. I mean, that's an example that's given in a different philosophical context. So I can really meditate on elephants sitting on the tip of a finger and do this for days and days and days until this experience becomes really vivid. And then I think that reality is basically that, right? So, I mean, this is the warning. So I think the Buddhist tradition and the Jain tradition say that why you need philosophy, why you need inquiry, why you need study is to guide your meditation. Because it's really easy in meditation to sometimes go down a rabbit hole of an illusory thing, and then just because the experience is so vivid, to end up believing that this is real. So you need that rational inquiry to guide your meditation. And therefore, ultimately, in the Buddhist case as well as the Jaina case, yes, yogic perception is something which transcends our ordinary experience. Maybe it's something beyond language. It's something which is experiential. But that doesn't mean we give up our philosophical inquiry or rational inquiry. We need it to guide our meditation, to know what we have to focus on in our meditation, to know what we are looking for, and then possibly find something more than what we thought we could find. But it's this symbiotic relationship, I think, that's very important to keep in mind.
That was excellent. So, well, I have two questions regarding that. One is, because this is very interesting, and I really like the way you put it about that the philosophy is actually guiding the meditation, and this is kind of relates to something that I'm often speaking about, this kind of synergy of knowledge and experience, right? That without knowledge, we can become, we will interpret sort of the fruits of our meditation practice in terms of whatever like vocabulary or set of experiences we have. So the knowledge of philosophy actually like gives us a broader container and a sort of matrix of understanding by means of which we can actually perhaps interpret or make sense of that experience in a more nuanced way. But I wonder if there's anything else, like I'm asking this for purely selfish reasons, because I'm beginning to work on a kind of a video essay on yoga philosophy and the question of yoga philosophy and what we even mean by that, because many people mean so many different things. But I guess at the bare minimum, yeah, in addition to this kind of guiding of experience, is there anything that you think kind of defines philosophies of yogic practice, whether it be in Jain tradition or the Buddhist tradition? Is it purely yogi pratyaksha, or is there anything else that you would say is kind of a defining feature of yoga philosophy?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, I think the way you spoke about synergy before we get to the question is, I think, really important. I think philosophy and experience synergize with each other. That's a beautiful way of putting it. I think yoga philosophy is this really interesting thing where, I mean, if it was purely about experience, then why do these texts even teach us that there is a philosophical worldview, right? We have to think about it that way. Even the Yoga Sutras, for example, clearly has a philosophical worldview. So do the Buddhist texts, so do the Jain texts. And I think, yes, it's about guiding our meditation. It's also, as you said, about interpreting, teaching us how to interpret our experiences, because otherwise we have no way of understanding our own experiences. But I think it's also deeper. I think, like, ultimately, at some deep level, it's the case that true wisdom and experience kind of intersect. It's not that, so I'm not about knowledge, but knowledge, more like wisdom. Wisdom and experience ultimately lead to the same thing. And so there isn't this polarity or dichotomy between the two. I mean, so Dharmakirti, for example, talks about yogi pratyaksha, but he also talks about chinta mayi prajna. So prajna is wisdom, which is born from contemplation. And he thinks that this wisdom born from contemplation is like the immediate precursor of that yogic experience, which is so interesting, right? Because, I mean, in a lot of popular formulations, we are told that, you have to transcend everything and only then you can have that yogic experience. But for Dharmakirti, that yogic experience comes as the final fruit after you have already cultivated to a very, very high degree the wisdom born of contemplation. So you think wisely and cultivate a wise understanding of reality. And I think this is really important as well. I mean, if we think about religious movements generally, I think that there is a danger for us to, if we don't have these philosophical resources, there's a danger to end up in a sort of cultist situation where you can just have people putting forward their own subjective experiences, which are not backed by deep reflection forward as what's real. And then you can have a situation where people just blindly follow that. I think the philosophy is a kind of useful check, that the experience we're aiming for is something that transcends philosophy in the final analysis, but it's something you achieve through philosophy, which means that you don't have to completely suspend your critical intellect, which I think is so important in the modern world, right? I mean, because it's all too easy to be told that, like, forget everything you believe, forget logic, reason, and just trust what I'm saying. And that can become a kind of power-based situation, which can give rise to a lot of dangerous things, I feel, in actual yogic communities today. And I think the classical Indian model is a much healthier model, precisely because it says that, you have to cultivate that reasoning and logic and question at every step of the way, so that you can finally get to a kind of wisdom where you can understand things clearly, and then you transcend it. It's not through a suspension of the intellect. And I think that's so important in our practice as well, because otherwise we are just lost, right? If we just suspend our intellect and say that reason and logic has no role, then how do you move forward? Then you just can become a pawn for the latest teacher who says whatever he or she thinks is true, and you have no way of questioning that. And I think that's another function of the classical Indian understanding of wisdom and experience ultimately coming together.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that, because I mean, you're right. There is this kind of way in which you, by surrendering your critical faculties, you're also, making yourself, susceptible to manipulation in various ways. I think there's also just, especially in the modern Pasho yoga world, there's this really annoying to me adage, 1% theory and 99% practice, which I just feel is kind of really inaccurate in a lot of ways for all the reasons that you're saying. So I'm curious actually for your personal experience. I saw a post that you did the other day of how meaningful meditation has been for you. And I didn't know you meditated. So I'm curious, have you had a taste of Yogi Pratyaksha, and has it influenced? Or do you feel like you've seen a kind of relationship between your meditation experience and your scholarly inquiry?
Yeah, that's a very good question. That's something I don't usually talk about, because exactly of the academic environment we are in, where we are taught to be like completely objective and dissociate from our subjectivities. But I mean, the meditative experience is basically when I was in Oxford. There's a wonderful place called the Oxford Buddha Vihara, which has Buddhist monks from the Theravada as well as the Mahayana tradition, and they have free meditation sessions every week, open to all, regardless of your background. This is when to it. And so I experienced the basic samatha meditation in Buddhism. And I felt that it had a significant positive impact on my life, because I realized how insanely neurotic I was. And that is something I didn't realize until I actually sat down and started observing my thoughts. And then I realized, oh wait, my thoughts are so neurotic. They're just going from A to B to F to Z with no pattern. And I think like I've studied philosophy, and like I'm someone in control of what I think and so on. But actually my brain operates in highly irrational patterns which are completely outside my control. And that for me was a big revelation. And meditation has had a positive impact on me in terms of like controlling my thought patterns and just being aware of what I'm experiencing. And I also immediately started to see relation to like things I'd read about in Buddhist philosophy, right? So this prapancha, this term Nagarjuna uses for this constant neurotic hypostatization, is a word that Indologists use, of what's going on in our head. And that's something I'd read about, but it's only when I started meditating that I realized, that is a thing. Then Dharmakirti, for example, talks about only the present moment being real, and the present moment being like an inexpressible particular, which you can't express in language, but you can only experience in that moment, basically. And that is something I really began to experience when I started meditating, because the focus of meditation is precisely, in at least the one I was doing, to be in the present moment and observe your mental state. And I realized that the particular mental state we have at every moment is so unique and rich in its own right. It can never be compared to any other prior or posterior mental state. And so I began to experience this, a lot of the things I'd read about, but I had no understanding of beyond like arguments for and against and like critical scholarship or whatever. I began to experience these things in my own life. And I think that is really, that has been great for me because as we were talking about synergy of like philosophy and experience. So many people often start with experience and don't have the philosophy. For me, it was the opposite. I had the philosophy, but I never had the experience until I started meditating. And like, then the things, a lot of the things I was reading about, I was like, yeah, I can like experientially observe this. And so this is no longer just an abstract theory, which I have to believe or disbelieve. It's something which is incredibly personal and part of my own experience. And that's been a great, a very rewarding experience. And I would definitely recommend that people who do purely philosophy should try to practice and like get into that more. Even if it's not a question even of whether you are a member of a tradition or not, it's a way of actually understanding those philosophical ideas more deeply. I feel like you haven't, as you wonderfully state at some point, that you can talk about a peach, but until you have eaten the peach, you don't fully know it. And so you can talk about a lot of complicated Buddhist and Jain ideas, but until you've actually meditated or taken up any other form of practice, you don't actually fully understand them.
Mm. Did you read my What is a Scholar Practitioner article? That sounds like a line from
that's a really wonderful article. Yeah.
Wow, I'm honored.
Exactly, that's where I got it from. Yeah, that's
awesome. Okay, well, this has been such a fantastic conversation, Shree, and but I want to end on one of my favorite topics, which is the state of scholarship with regards to kind of Indian philosophy and philology and I there's like several ways to go, and I don't want to, it could be kind of its own conversation in of itself, and I don't want to talk too much shit, but I do want to just, bring up this, well, I'll back up. So you and I similarly came from philosophical backgrounds before Indology, but you were much more, I think, analytic in training. I was sort of in a, the fluffy continental school, and then you said, and then you got into Indology basically through the focus on Sanskrit. And I'm curious and now, you're doing Indian philosophy, and I really like the way you write. It's like, it has that sort of philosophical cadence that's clear, and you go from point A to point B. And I'm just wondering if you have any observations around like philologists doing Indian philosophy. Like what kind of deserves to be explored or focused on in terms of philosophy, or how should we be attending to these texts that, I don't know, doesn't reduce them to the range of considerations that are kind of prioritized by philologists? Like, I guess you see any tension there with having the philologists do all the philosophy with these Indian texts? Maybe that's a clearer, more to the point question.
So I think that's a very, very complicated question. And as you rightly said, we can talk about it for a long time. I think the first thing to say is that Indian philosophy is starting to get a bit more recognition in academia.
Yeah,
so Oxford has recently appointed a professor in Indian philosophy in their philosophy department. And this is a trend I observe in many international universities. And so that's really good, I think. In terms of how we approach the study of Indian philosophy, I think, again, I would say anekantavada, there doesn't need to be only one approach, basically. So I think the way I approached my work is that I was reacting against a lot of Orientalist scholarship, which was prevalent in the 18th and 19th centuries, which said that Indians don't really have philosophy. They have all of these religious beliefs and practices and mumbo jumbo. But if you're talking about philosophy as like actual rational inquiry, where you're trying to get at the truth, Indians don't really have that. And so some of my work has been trying to show that no. If we read like Buddhist and Jain philosophical texts, and I'm sure Hindu texts too, they present really, really sophisticated arguments, and these are arguments that can be tested as any other argument from any other tradition. Like they can stand the logical scrutiny and critical examination. And in fact, what I've uncovered during my study is that, for example, Buddhist texts have arguments for idealism, which is a view that some Buddhists subscribe to, which are not found in the entire history of Western philosophy for 2,000 years, like before or after. So not only do they have really good arguments, they in fact have really interesting, unique arguments which have no parallel in the Western tradition. So this is exactly why we need like comparative philosophy, because I feel like every philosophical tradition, every culture captures different aspects of reality, right? This is the Jain idea. And so I think that is one way of approaching this Indian philosophy, where we try to show that, this is philosophy by those rigid analytic philosophy standards that have been set in our culture, at least in the Anglosphere. But the other thing to do is, of course, to question those very standards, right? Because I think like one of the reasons I got away from analytic philosophy is because I found it to be incredibly constraining and stifling. Because the kind of questions that were allowed to be asked were incredibly limited. Even if you think within the history of Western philosophy, Plato talks about justice, about beauty, about love, and so many different things. And by the time you come to analytic philosophy in the 21st century, like the scope has shrunk to like these set of questions. And so I think one of the things we need to do through Indian philosophy is challenge the very notion or the hegemonic concepts of what constitutes philosophy, at least in the analytic Anglosphere. Because I think that's incredibly limiting. It excludes all forms of literature. It excludes all forms of, all discussions which can't be like formalized into a syllogism, which is absurd. The idea that only things which can be stated in syllogisms are ultimately like true or can get to the truth, that's like an incredibly narrow view of what truth can be. Because truth can be so many different things. There's artistic truth, there's knowledge of knowing how to do things, and then there's knowledge of propositions, knowledge that, right? So I think like we need to use Indian philosophical texts to challenge these narrow concepts of philosophy. And I think what you are also doing is then going further. It's not just about showing that Indian philosophy counts as philosophy by those standards, which is one thing, or challenging those dominant concepts of philosophy by showing that philosophy can also be done in other ways. But then the third thing is to then bring in the practitioner, where we go beyond just the text, because a lot of Indology, unfortunately, is a kind of fetishization of this ancient culture. It's a kind of fossilization and a museumization, which is a very, very, actually a very modern attitude, even in the West. It's only something that's a few centuries old. That's not even how, I don't know, Platonists or Christians in the medieval or earlier times in the West would have thought about their own traditions. I think there's an incredibly dangerous modern attitude and approach to traditions where we fossilize them and study them as curiosities. This is not how things have been in almost any culture, including the West, until a few centuries ago. And I think it's important to challenge that. Because again, knowledge is not just knowledge that or knowledge of text, it's also knowledge how, right? And this is something even analytic philosophers occasionally acknowledge, right? So then knowledge how is something you only acquire by actually practicing. And we have to break down this idea that, we can only be objective if we are, completely dissociated from the tradition. Like, that is a huge fallacy, because there's no way you can be dissociated from a tradition. You're just part of another tradition. You're part of this tradition of objective scholarship, which has its own presuppositions and its own limitations, just like being part of any Indian tradition has its own presuppositions and its own limitations. So I think there is no point from nowhere. There is no viewpoint from nowhere. That's really important for us to understand. And once we understand that, then we can see that we want viewpoint from many viewpoints from somewhere, right? So one viewpoint from somewhere is showing that Indian philosophy is like really good analytic philosophy. One viewpoint from somewhere is to challenge the paradigm of analytic philosophy, showing that Indian philosophy is different. Another viewpoint from somewhere is to show that you can actually be a practitioner, and that influences positively in various ways how we can understand and appreciate these texts. So I think it's a combination of all of these approaches that we need in the study of Indian philosophy.
That was so excellent. Such a great way to end. And I'm so delighted that we're on the same page with regards to all of this. I wanted to end up asking a question about, how kind of Western philosophy needs to sort of, reimagine or approach its self-image afresh. And I think you did a really excellent job answering that question even without me asking it. And I completely agree at 100%. And I'm excited to know that, that there are folks who are very well trained like yourself, who are also as committed to kind of that provocative, but yet very necessary approach to, the study of philosophy and the way in which we integrate Indian philosophy into the larger kind of philosophical conversation or conversations. So Shree, you're going to be back with us in the fall for a part of a series that I'm going to be hosting on embodied philosophy called the Living Room Lectures. And I believe we've talked about you doing a talk on Yogi Pratyaksha, although maybe we'll refine, or I know we talked about it here, but of course there's more places to potentially go with that, obviously. But I wanted to just let people know who are listening that's happening. So obviously, Shree is a wealth of information, lots of things to learn. And so do keep an eye on your inbox for the notice of that event or that series of events that will be starting in sometime in October. Shree, is there anything else that you want to share about what you're doing, where people can find you? Are there any kind of anything published yet that you'd like to share? Anything of that nature?
Not really, no. I mean, I just finished my DPhil recently, so I'm starting to write. I'm going to publish my first article soon in the Journal of Indian Philosophy, and I've tried to make sure that it's open access, because I think a lot of these academic articles are written in journals which are accessible to no one except like a very small community of Indologists. So I've tried to make sure that this is open access, and I think it's about Jain philosophy. And once it comes out, it's about exactly this Anekantavada and these ideas. So I hope if people are interested in Jain philosophy, they can read up on that. But in general, I think it's not so much about me. I think it's about this idea of people who are curious and want to know more. So I would just say to the listeners that keep reading more and more about Indian philosophy and about Indian religious practices and philosophical traditions. And that is I feel like that's a journey which continues to enrich one's life, and there's no end to it, and it's a source of joy. And so that's all I have to say.
Excellent. Well, actually, on that note, Shree, do you have recommendations for 2 or 3 books that provide a kind of accessible or perhaps comprehensive introduction to Jain philosophy or Indian philosophy more generally? Anything that just kind of comes to mind as something you'd like to share with the listeners where they can kind of learn more?
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a bit of introductory textbooks on Indian philosophy. So like classical Indian philosophy, a reader is quite good. I think Jonardhan Ganeri has quite a few introductory books on Indian philosophy, which are quite good. But I think another way of approaching Indian philosophy is to just take one of these really great texts and read a good translation. So, I mean, one of the things that I did was like, I took a translation of the principal Upanishads and I read them, and they were so inspiring in the original, because I feel like anything you read in secondary scholarship is already like filtering a lot of it out and rationalizing and structuring it. The fun is to like encounter the texts on their own. So maybe like if you're the ones to start with would be like the Upanishads. They are always inspirational. You could read some Mahayana sutras like the Diamond Sutra or the Heart Sutra. They are incredibly inspirational as well. If you prefer narrative and you prefer to think about things through narrative, then India has 2 really amazing epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, which talk about all of these same philosophical ideas but embody them in characters with distinct personalities. So those are really good starting points. So I think there are introductory readers, classical Indian philosophy reader, if you're into that kind of thing, or pick up a good translation of a classic Indian philosophical text and just read it and struggle with it on your own. And a lot of things you'll find are like really profound. And then there'll be things which are like, what does this possibly mean? So that's the whole fun of it.
That's great. That's a great recommendation. Yeah, I'm creating kind of a list of a reading list for the listeners for kind of Chitheads in general. And each time I interview, I used to ask actually people every time if they'd recommend a couple books, but I sort of forgot. And so we're going to kind of pick that up again. And so I'll add an Upanishads translation, and perhaps not many listeners will be able to listen or to read it kind of in the original text, but maybe there'll be a few of you. And that's definitely a great suggestion. I mean, if you can, and I mean, if you can't, this is a great inspiration, or rather justification for learning Sanskrit, because you get to do exciting things like reading it in its, original text, and certainly.
Yeah, or even if we don't know Sanskrit, I think read translations. The key to make sure is that the translator is a scholar who knows the language. That's really important. So the translator should be someone who knows the language and has ideally spent a few years trying to work on those texts. Provided that criterion is met, I think you can pick up any of these translations. I don't think, importantly, I don't think this knowledge should be restricted by language, because Sanskrit is a very difficult language, and obviously not everybody can invest the time to learn it. It takes a while to learn. But I think you should definitely read these texts in a translation, even if you don't know the language, because even in translation, I think you lose something, but a lot of it is retained, and the power of the texts come through. Yeah.
Very good. Yes. So this has been so excellent, Shree. It really has been an exciting conversation for me. It's been lively and fun and interesting, and I know people are going to really love listening to it. Those of you who are still in the room with us, thank you so much for tuning in and watching this live version of Chitheads. I didn't see any questions until just now, and unfortunately we're a little late on time, so I will pass the question on, or rather send me an email and I can forward it along. chitheads@embodiedphilosophy.com is the email that will get to me. That's chitheads, CHITHEADS, a C at the beginning, at embodiedphilosophy.com, and I'll be sure to forward along your questions to Shree. Again, I've been speaking to Shree Nahata, friend and former fellow student at the University of Oxford. Thank you, Shree, so much for your time today. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's been a really fun conversation, really stimulating, and I think what you're doing is amazing because it's really forcing people to think out of the box. And yeah, this has been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Shree.